psychedelics only really affirmed and deepened my own understanding of the Christian tradition. I didn't have any desire to leave it. I had a desire to wake the rest of the church up to what's possible. Is really what I had to bring this healing into the mainstream conversation. Again, it's not for everybody. It's not a magic bullet, but it's a valuable tool that we need to take seriously. And if we don't care about healing, I'm not sure what the church cares about.
The amazing thing about the mushrooms is that they speak. They talk to you. They will answer questions, carry on conversations. Psilocybin just pulls up a chair on the porch and puts its feet up.
Hey there, welcome back to another episode of Psilocybin Says. That's right, today I'm talking with Hunt Priest. If you haven't heard of Hunt Priest, then you're probably not very involved in the psychedelic spiritual community because he's doing some pretty profound work that's getting a lot of attention. What is he doing? Well, Hunt is I think he's an Episcopalian minister. I'm blanking right now. He talks about it in the episode, but he is a Christian minister who has developed a community called Ligare, Ligare, that is basically a organization for psychedelic Christians. And I know there's a bunch of y'all out there that might be how Christianity started. If you look at some of the interesting archaeological evidence, lots and lots of murals and frescoes and pictures or images of this guy they call Jesus surrounded by mushrooms. We talk about that in this episode, as you can probably imagine, but we get into a lot of different conversations about what he's doing, about what it means to be a psychedelic Christian, the future of Christian churches and the integration of psychedelics, particularly psilocybin. You know, this is a sacrament that has been with us, well, at least 12,000 years, because we've seen the paintings on the cave walls of Psilocybe semilenziata surrounded by cows and bulls. So we know that psilocybin has played a crucial role in human spiritual development. I tend to think that not only did psychedelics influence religion, but that psychedelics are the original religion. I really believe that. I'm not sure the Hunt agrees necessarily, but anyway, we have a great conversation that ranges from the mental health benefits, the spiritual experience, and surprisingly, towards the end there, we start to get into some things like spirits and entities, and his reflections, contributions to the conversation might not be what you expect. Even the ketamine clinics are starting to have some interesting phenomena show up. So we predicted this a while back that the psychedelic therapy community is going to be coming to the psychedelic spiritual community for some insight. There's a reason why these tools were used in a shamanic way for tens of thousands of years. We do not live in just a material, mechanical world. There are energies all about us. That's my belief anyway. You don't have to believe, but maybe through this conversation you'll get a little different perspective. I think it's really important and really valuable to get different perspectives. Please like, share, comment on the YouTube. I know you want to help this show succeed because you keep showing up. If you're new to this show, please give us a review. Or if you've never given it a review, please, it goes so far. On iTunes, on Spotify, on YouTube, do all the things that help to boost the algorithm, and I will continue to express my deep, abiding appreciation for you, the audience, because without you on the other side of this camera or speaker, then I'd probably be here just talking to myself. So I'm grateful that there's somebody listening. All right, let's get forward to the conversation with Hunt Priest. I hope you enjoy. See you on the other side of the mushroom. All right, Hunt Priest, welcome to Psilocybin Says.
Thank you.
Yeah, it is a pleasure to have you. I have been watching your work from afar for quite a while, and I know my audience is going to want to know how you got into psychedelics, but first of all, I want to know how you got into spirituality.
Okay, well, good. So I grew up in the church. I'm an Episcopal priest. I was ordained second career. I was not ordained until I was 40, but growing up in the church. I grew up in Kentucky, so not far from Lexington, a small town, Mount Sterling, Kentucky, and in a family that went to church, and both in the Disciples of Christ, which is a pretty progressive, open-minded denomination. And then when I got a little bit older, we moved to the Episcopal Church, which is where my grandmother was and my aunt. So, but had a very, in spite of the fact that I grew up in the Bible Belt, had a very kind of open-minded and progressive understanding of Christianity. But it was very important to me and to my family. That was part of our kind of pattern of life. And stayed as part of church in my 20s and 30s, and had always kind of had this nudge to ordination, and finally moved on that. And I was probably 33 or 34, and I worked for Delta Airlines. I lived in Atlanta at the time, and I worked for Delta Airlines and worked for an advertising agency as a copywriter, and discerned this priesthood over time, and then graduated from seminary and was ordained at 40. And I'm about to be 60. So for the last 20 years, been working in churches, working as a ordained leader in churches, and obviously value the ministry of the church, and working at this intersection of Christianity and psychedelics. And some more about that in a minute. But I always kind of had mystical. I mean, I was kind of a mystical kid. I think I always really understood God to be in nature, and God was revealed in nature. I grew up in a part of Kentucky that looks out into the mountains, like the foothills of the Appalachians are about 20 miles away. So I was just always mesmerized by the mountains and by nature. And I grew up on the edge of town. So I grew up walking in cow pastures and tobacco fields, and just preferred to be out in the yard, and had a strong sense of God's presence everywhere, but certainly in nature.
I had no idea that I was going to feel this level of affinity to you this quickly, just like knowing that we shared that same landscape, growing up like I did in Washington County. It was just tobacco fields and rolling hills and creeks. And that is absolutely where I found God. I grew up Catholic, but it was so much a part of my experience there. That sounds like a pretty dramatic shift, though, to go from working for Delta into priesthood. Did you have to do some significant kind of adjustments there?
Well, I don't know about. Well, it was always. Not really. I mean, there was a whole process. You can't, in the Episcopal Church, you just can't say, I think I want to be ordained. There's a whole discernment process. So I went through that, and it deepened my own. I ended in that process. They asked me to take another year to discern, and I worked with the spiritual director for a year, and felt like I was really finally ready to do it. So the skills, I think I got some skills in that working in corporate world. The Episcopal Church did like people to have some other career before they went to seminary. So I kind of had two, but and I think that helped me kind of see where people are in their lives, understanding that there's all this pressure that people are under, work pressure, family pressure, making a living. And so I think I had a good sense of where the realities of life by the time I got to ordination at 40. I'd already sort of lived and had ups and downs, and I think it made me a better pastor, actually. I
was going to ask, something that I have been reflecting on the last couple of years as I've been, formally in ministership, is that as I look back at my life, in a lot of ways, I think I've always kind of been ministering, right? I've always had a real deep concern for the people that I've been with, and people have very often come to me with questions and whatnot. So is that kind of what you're like?
I think that's exactly right. That's sort of, there's just a natural pastoral position or openness that I think sounds like that's what you had too. People confided in me. People asked my advice about things I probably shouldn't have been given advice about. But I was the person that people came to for something.
In those cow pastures, were you also picking mushrooms or no?
No, my psychedelic experiences came later, and that in fact, and I was around. Not always. I was around it in my college years and after, but I just had never. It wasn't like I hadn't done illegal things, but I'd not done that. And the study I was in, which we can talk about in a minute, at Hopkins, one of the requirements is that I was psychedelically naive. So
that's right.
At 51, I've had my first experience. Although that was following a whole lot of other experiences I had in my life that were non-ordinary in different ways. So
can we talk about that? I'd love to get into some of the non-ordinary mystical states that were not psychedelic induced before we get into the plants themselves.
Yeah. Well, I think in dreams, for one thing, as a child, I had really magical, mysterious dreams. That was one place. And I think if Scripture's any guide, that we know that that's one of the ways that we believe God talks to us is through dreams. That's very well documented in Scripture. The sense I had of God's presence in everything. Like there was a time in my life that I wouldn't step on rocks because I think that I saw them as holy and sentient in a way, and aware of bees and birds and the beauty of creation. So, in a way that was not just observing, I felt a part of it. And then later, as a kind of church going kid, I really the smells and bells of that took me into the language of the Episcopal liturgies, took me into a place that was kind of non-ordinary at times. The Eucharist was always very meaningful to me, much more than just taking bread and wine. I felt mystery and magic in that. And then as I got older, sometimes in church, I would, as a layperson, I would really be moved to tears occasionally by something somebody said or watching somebody receive communion. I was a part of in my late 20s and early 30s, a part of a very unusual Episcopal church called Church of the Holy Comforter in Atlanta, which is where I lived at the time. And 80% of the people lived with severe, persistent mental illness, lived in group homes, most of them. So 80% of the congregation lived in those situations. And then 20%, the rest of us kind of supported the ministry of the place. It wasn't a do-good project. We were all the church, and we brought our gifts and our own hurts and our own gifts and challenges to that space. And I saw the church really being the church for the first time, I think, in my life, being fully present to the suffering of people on the margins, poor people, Black people, people with severe and persistent mental illness, people that were really, that had no other support than what they were getting from the government and from this very unusual church community. So I was there 5 years as a parishioner and discerned my call to the priesthood there, which is very interesting now to come back to the intersection of spirituality, mental health, mystical experiences. But in that congregation, I would see the power of the liturgy. I would see the power of people discovering their own dignity, being treated with dignity, being able to serve to the extent of their gifts. So people that couldn't even pronounce Episcopalian were, or maybe they could pronounce it, but they really didn't even know what it meant necessarily, were lay readers. They assisted with communion. They were full members of the church. Even if they didn't really know the difference between the Presbyterians and the Episcopalians, they were part of this community that embraced them and respected their dignity and empowered their dignity. So in many ways, I saw the place where Jesus I think would be. And I saw the church really embracing people in a way that I'd not seen before, the full diversity of people.
That's beautiful.
So it's beautiful. And so now, I don't know, 30 years later, I find myself back at this intersection of spirituality and religion and mystical experiences and healing and the dignity of every human being. So,
I'd like to ask, in your involvement in that very unique church, I'm curious if you witnessed individuals who their mental health crisis mental health may have been as much of a matter of spiritual health or experience. I guess just to give a little bit of context, in a lot of the work that I've done with people who were relatively severely mentally ill, and I include myself in that as a borderline personality, very often see that some of the most spiritually adept individuals are some of the most struggle with mental illness the most. And I'm curious.
There's something there. So one of the things that I loved about that church and makes answering this question a little difficult is we never talked about diagnosis. So I knew that people lived in group homes, and I really never knew. I think there was a lot of schizophrenia there. I think there was a lot of just severe depression. I think there was some learning disability. So it was hard to kind of know. And I often say that the mental health crisis is a spiritual crisis. I think there's some truth to that. And I think some of the most creative people in the world are people that deal with severe, persistent mental illness. One of the things we discovered there was that a lot of the people, I do know that some of the people were schizophrenic because of the way they talked about it. And some of those people were artists, painters and poets. And so I don't know. there seems to be a correlation.
Oh,
So
I've seen some incredible like clairvoyancy come out of people who would have been diagnosed with various mental illnesses. I've seen some incredible phenomena that I can only ascribe to, this breaking down between the worlds, and often feel that if those individuals had more support, that they could be some of our most powerful healers and teachers.
And the issue with this, yes, and the issue with this congregation was the people were at the end of their support systems. They'd, for various reasons, they're cut off from their families. Sometimes it's just so much people can't deal with it, or whatever. I mean, and the economic pressure that people are under. So, yeah, if people, and that's what the community was trying to do, was support their creativity and so there was the church. I mean, there was the church part, but then during the week on Tuesdays and Thursdays, there was a complete arts program with arts painting studio. There was a wood turning shop. There was a poetry workshops. There was an organic garden for people that wanted to do something with their hands. So the creativity part of that was very important to the life of the community. So, yeah, and I even wondered, as I'm thinking about your question, like, of the great historic mystics of the church, like Julian of Norwich, I'm wondering what kind of diagnosis she would have, what she would have, what diagnosis Paul would have.
Yeah.
I mean, I say Paul was the church's first mystic. What would be his diagnosis? What is the thorn in his flesh? Is that some sort of mental illness? So,
yeah, I think it's a valid question.
So I think we need to quit I think we need to. That's one of the things that we've done is pathologize everything, and neurodivergency, and these kind of varying degrees of autism or depression or borderline personality. I mean, those we probably should be. I know we should be more open to not pathologize and diagnose every time and just accept people for who they are.
Yeah, I agree.
Just as I am without one plea, as the old Baptist hymn says.
So where did psychedelics come in then? How did you break that seal?
I was living in Seattle. I was the rector of an Episcopal church in not far from downtown Seattle, and I was at home on a rainy afternoon in the fall, and was flipping through Christian Century, which is one of the progressive kind of magazines of the church, mainline Christianity, flipping through there and saw an ad and a story about a study at Johns Hopkins and NYU looking for religious professionals who were psychedelically naive. And I thought, oh my God, Johns Hopkins and NYU care about what religious professionals have to say about something. Well, first of all, that's interesting. Second of all, it was around these questions of mental health. And that was interesting because of what I mentioned before, and because of living in the world we live in. And sort of issues of addiction in my own family. And then and I thought, I applied. Well, there's no way I'm going to get in this, because who wouldn't want to do this? But I applied, and they were having trouble filling it up. It took a long time. This was before Michael Pollan had written his books. It was before people.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it was 2015.
Okay.
And what they were trying to see in that study was using the protocols they were using for the mental health studies. People were having religious and spiritual experiences. So to bring in people trained in this to see how we would respond was they were curious as researchers, and so that's what brought us in there, and all of that interested me, and it just seemed like an amazing place to have an experience. Like I said, I've been around it and didn't really have a judgment about psychedelics at all. I just didn't feel necessarily a call to it or a need for it, and then thought, well, there's no better place than there to have this experience. And I wasn't afraid, but I thought, well, my God, this is part of it. And I've always been interested in research, and the intersection of religion and science and spirituality has always been interesting to me too. So
did you ever have experience with cannabis or any mind? Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. And was that ever a spiritual experience for you?
Not then. Yeah. It has been since then.
Okay.
But no, I just didn't see it that way. I think, and I think I even have a different understanding with alcohol now. I mean, I think the fact that we call it spirits is something we should pay attention to. And I think that we abuse everything. This culture abuses everything. So we abuse alcohol, we abuse tobacco, we abuse cannabis instead of seeing them as entryways to higher consciousness. And I think all of those things can be. I don't
Agreed.
think it's an accident that Jesus was making more wine. I mean, I think that's, in John's gospel, I think all those things are important for us to look at. And it's not about checking out, it's about checking in.
Yes.
And,
Yes.
and I think that's one of the places that psilocybin and other psychedelics can really help us with. But also, these other substances too. We just have we have a bad, unhealthy relationship with substances.
Yeah.
And that's one of the dangers of psychedelics. Not that they're addictive, but the experience can be addictive. So all these things we need to be talking about as much as we can.
Agreed. And I mean, I think that bleeds over into a lot of our lifestyle choices. I mean, look, sexuality, food.
Yes.
We have
Oh my God, yes.
we have a unhealthy relationship with a lot of different parts of our lifestyle. And, that's part of the premise of this podcast, is that through looking at lifestyle through a psychedelic lens, that we can develop healthier relationships with all of these aspects
Yes.
of ourself. So
Amen to that.
you're so the mushroom experience itself. Now I'm waiting with bated breath for this research study to come out. I just can't wait to see, even though I feel like I have a pretty good idea of what it's going to say. What can you share with us about the experience itself, or what's coming out of that research?
Yeah, I'll just say I'm not privy to any of the lower I'm just, that's part of the research process, I guess. But I was in Denver, and I think you were at the Psychedelic Science Conference, and Roland Griffiths, before he died, and a couple other people made a presentation about preliminary results of that. And I know one of the things that came out of that for all of us that were in that study, and so just quickly, who was in that, I think there were 25 or 26 of us. You had to be a religious professional, which means one thing in Christianity. In Judaism, it's rabbis. In Islam, it's imams, but it can also be educators. So there was one Muslim woman in that study. She's a chaplain. She was a chaplain. And so she was a religious professional. 4 rabbis. I think there were 2 Buddhist monks or priests, and then various kinds and flavors of Christian pastors. So several, mostly mainline. There was 1 Roman Catholic, 1 Eastern Orthodox, I think, Greek Orthodox, but mostly Episcopalians, Lutherans, Methodists, Presbyterians, 1 American Baptist, United Church of Christ, kind of the usual mainline suspects, from mostly from the East. I was on the West Coast, 1 other person on the West Coast, but it was at Hopkins and NYU. So it was a lot of East Coasters, but mostly all the mainline traditions are represented in that. And I think one of the things that was, I know for me, and I think this is probably for all of us, is that we had a much deeper appreciation of our ministry and our tradition. There's a lot of burnout in religious professions, just like there are in any helping professions. And I think anxiety and depression and addiction are kind of rampant in those circles, sadly. And because the church is getting smaller, there's a lot of pressure, institutional pressure, there's a lot of personal pressure. And I think people succumb to a lot of bad habits. So I think to have an appreciation of your own tradition, your own ministry, and then a broader appreciation of the other traditions came out in those experiences too. So I think the churches need to pay attention to this, because I think it can be about clergy wellness. I think often this was the case for me. I went to seminary because I'd had mystical experiences, because I really valued those. I thought the spirituality was what was important. Went to seminary, got some excellent training, but began to get all up in my head, as I say, and look for ways to problem solve using my head. Okay, so the church is declining. So what class do I need to take? What book do I need to read? What shift do we need to make in the worship or whatever else? And instead of really connecting to I lost track of my own spiritual thread and my spiritual grounding in an attempt at institutional maintenance and growth. So I'm not sure that's the case for everybody, but I know it was for me. And what came in those 2 psilocybin experiences I had at Hopkins was a profound reconnection to my body, profound reconnection to the Holy Spirit, and a beautiful expansion of my understanding of ministry and ordination. So it was, when I say significant, that it was life-changing, ministry-changing, and it didn't cause me to want to give up on my priesthood or on the Christian church or on the Episcopal church. It just helped me see what's missing. And what people really need are these profound experiences of God that can happen with psychedelics. But I'd had those before psychedelics, so I don't think it has to be that. It doesn't have to be that at all, but it's one of the ways. And so I rambled off the question. I'm sorry about that.
No, it's beautiful. That's beautiful. It's beautiful. And I mean, that is what then led to the formation of Ligare. Is that correct? Or
Yeah, so 5 years. So that first experience was in 22 experiences in the winter of 16. That's following summer. Part of that experience there was realized we were in Seattle for 8 years. By then had a 16-year-old son, and realized that it was time for us to come back closer to home, to family, to the Southeast, which is where our families were, and all of our network. And those years in Seattle were fantastic, and it was really wonderful in various ways for all of us. And after that experience, I realized I'd done what I could do there. The church I'd grown because of my relationships with the people there. I think I'd done some pretty good work there over time, and it was time for us to move. And so that was so clear to me. That's one of the things people say about psychedelics is I had a real clarity. I didn't do anything right away, but by the August of that year, I was in Savannah and was the pastor of a church here. Had wonderful 5 years. And in the course of that, with COVID and me knowing that my ministry was going to change because of that experience, in November of 2020, I began to discern that there was no mechanism or institution or group to bring the results of the science back to the church. So I started Ligare over the course of about 4 months to discern what that should look like, at least the first stages of that. And so we incorporated a nonprofit. That happened in June of 21. We got our nonprofit status a year later. And in the meantime, it was just building networks, having conversations like this, finding other people. And now we have a mailing list of about 2,000 people, a lot of clergy, a lot of people that are active Christians, a lot of people with a Christian background, a lot of people that are sort of finding Christianity in the midst of a psychedelic experience. So amazing diversity of people, and all over the world now, mostly in the U.S. and some in Europe, some in Canada, some in Mexico. A couple people in Australia. So yeah.
So before we get into kind of the broader conversation of psychedelics and spirituality and Christianity in particular, can you share with the audience a little bit about what Ligare does? I mean, are you meeting virtually regularly? What kind of workshops or education?
Yeah.
I think you'll have a conference coming up.
We do.
Conference.
Yeah, we have a small. So yeah, thank you for that. So really, one thing about the word Ligare is it means to bind or to unite. It's Latin, to bind or to unite. And in antiquity, I've read that it was also understood to be the connection between the human and the divine, to bind that. And the word religion is religare, to rebind. So what I'd like to, and as I joke, but it's kind of true, I looked up ligare.org and it was available. So I snagged it because I knew what that word was. And that's really how we've been gathering virtually mostly. We've done some in-person, like small things in places where I've traveled to introduce people to the concept that actually Christianity and psychedelics can coexist, because they do coexist for a lot of people. And so we do monthly forums. In January we started small spiritual direction groups, which is spiritual direction is one of the gifts of the Christian tradition. It's spiritual companionship. So these groups are 4 or 5 people that meet monthly with a trained spiritual director to discern both the possibility of having a psychedelic experience or to make meaning of experiences people have already had. Do that with other people with varying backgrounds and experience. We're not offering psychedelic experiences, but we're offering kind of discernment for that, preparation for that, and then integration of that. Knowing that people have access to psychedelics in varying places, and that's happening right now, and we want to give people the tools they need to do that healthy in a safe and healthy way, and then provide meaning making after, and connect people to this rich. As you as a Catholic know something about the mystical tradition of Christianity, but most Protestants don't. The more Protestant a tradition is, say in Baptist or that the mystical tradition is lost to them mostly. So I think in the Catholic tradition, the Episcopal tradition, Orthodoxy, in varying places and other mainline traditions. It's there, but it almost got lost. And people like Richard Rohr and Thomas
Mm-hmm.
Merton and Matthew
Mm-hmm.
Fox and Cynthia Bourgeois are bringing that back into awareness. That began to happen in the 70s, in some ways because of the first wave of psychedelic interest.
Did
Kind of Western.
did Thomas Merton ever speak of psychedelic experiences?
He did in a very, this is in the 50s, and he was suspicious.
Uh-huh.
Houston Smith, who was a contemporary and
Uh-huh.
certainly a religion scholar and a very committed Christian, spoke very favorably. He was part of the Good Friday experiment. So
Right.
Howard Thurman, very important Christian mystic and leader in the mid-20th century, was the chaplain at Boston University when the Good Friday experiment was happening. And I heard that it was his idea to bring that there. So Howard Thurman is an important person in this discussion too. So Merton was certainly open, and I think that if he'd moved, had he lived, he was killed in '68 or died in some people say killed, but died in '68. Having these interreligious and interspiritual conversations, I think he would have come around. But it was the '60s and '50s, and he was suspicious.
Well, he was hanging out with Hunter S. Thompson.
Sure, right, yeah. Exactly. So he's right there in Kentucky.
Yeah.
Who knows what his private?
Right.
There was a letter, something he wrote. I can't remember exactly, but there was a scholar published a book just this year on Merton's conversations in California, and it seemed to be moving more in that direction. So
I have a friend. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, he died too soon.
Indeed, he did. Yeah. No, I had a friend who broke into Merton's cabin at the monastery of Gethsemane and took ayahuasca there one night.
I'm sure that's exactly. I'm sure that's.
I thought it was pretty cool.
It's great. Yeah, that's really, I know some of those stories. I've heard a couple of those stories too, and I think those are magical, mysterious places full of a lot of spiritual energy. So it'd be interesting to know what he said about that. To be in the place where Merton would be holy in and of itself. So
for sure, for sure. No, I could go off on a tangent on Merton. I've read a lot of his stuff over the years, but
I think real quick, another interesting connection to the Trappists, which that Gethsemane is a Trappist monastery. There's a monastery in South Carolina called Mepkin Abbey, which
I've been there.
Oh, have you? That's a very important place to me. And it turns out that land was donated by the Luces, Henry and Claire Booth Luce, who were very active in psychedelic. The reason we know about Gordon Wasson is because he was published in Life magazine, owned by and Claire, his wife. They're buried there. They're buried at Mepkin. They gave that land to the Trappists in the 50s and wanted to have religious use. Claire had done a lot of LSD with her therapist in the 50s and then with her priest in the 60s. She was a convert to Catholicism after the untimely death of her daughter, was dealing with depression, did a lot of work with Gerald Hurd with LSD, and then later with her priest. And that's in her papers that are at the Smithsonian, or that at the Library of Congress, her papers at the Library of Congress. And there's trip reports in there of her praying the Mass and then taking LSD.
Wow. Yeah, church would have been a lot more fun with LSD.
in the 60s. Yeah. So.
All right. So I want to get into this kind of intersect of mental health, spirituality, psychedelics, like you're saying. And I'm so curious what you're seeing. Can you talk about kind of broadly what you're seeing in your community and how people are kind of melding these worlds together?
Well, I'll say there's a lot of Christians out there using or have used or want to use psychedelics. So it is existing. So to answer that question, can psychedelics and Christianity coexist? Yes, because they already do. And there's a lot of interest in what happened in antiquity in early Christian communities, and I think that's important to talk about in research. But we've got modern use, and so what we're discovering is people are having mystical experiences with psychedelics and having Christian experiences with psychedelics, and need resources for that, need guidance in some cases for that, need ways to stay safe with that. And I'm waiting for the pushback. People say, is there pushback? And there's been a little bit, but I would say overall there's more curiosity about it and concerns about the legality, but not even that much of that. People People are going ahead, and we're not hosting retreats. We did do one retreat in the Netherlands a couple of years ago and realized that was probably not our main work. Our main work is the network of resources and education. So we're finding a huge interest in spiritual direction. Those groups filled up almost immediately. We're also supporting and encouraging and connecting scholars to each other. So there's been a recent wave of scholarship around scripture and psychedelics, around theology and psychedelics, around Catholicism and psychedelics. So those are resources that we have and we share, and we'll have more of that. And then this conference we're doing in Richmond, Virginia, is for spiritual directors. So for people that don't know what that is, another way to talk about that is spiritual companionship. That's something that happens in monasteries. It's not Merton. Merton was a spiritual guide for a lot of people. Had a spiritual director, as do I. I've had one for 20 years, and that's a spiritual friend, a person you can bring, ask for accountability on your spiritual practices, can bring the wealth of the Christian tradition into the conversations and these monthly conversations that we have. So finding a lot of energy in that, finding a lot of energy in the scholarship, and finding a lot of need for just general education around spiritual practices and where they intersect with psychedelic experiences and integration and meaning making. So we're just now starting, and I think we've tapped into a real need, and the resources are there. We're not really inventing it. We're just bringing it together and putting it in, almost at packaging, but that sounds like marketing. We're putting it in containers for people to for some people have no idea that meditation is part of the Christian tradition. So sadly, that's how off the Christianity's gotten from its traditional base of Jesus going off to meditate. When the people started driving him crazy, he'd go to the wilderness to get away. So try to reclaim that idea that Christianity is not just about talking. It's not just about dogma. It's not just about scripture. It's about spiritual practice.
The direct experience,
and
right?
Direct experience. Like why we ever thought that God stopped offering experiences of God's self to people and made that a 2,000 year ago thing. That is so messed up. And that I've never thought that, but I think a lot of people do. Like God stopped talking. So now we just got to go with what people thought 2,000 years ago. And Protestantism, the Protestant Reformation was important, but Luther didn't want to start a new church. He wanted to reform the old one. And I think we're in one of those Reformation periods right now.
That's what I wanted to ask. Like, how do you see this like impacting just American Christianity? You know, I mean, surely you're already seeing it, right? And so, how do you envision that unfolding in the coming years?
Well, I think Carl Rauner, kind of familiar quote from Carl Rauner, that the Christian of the future will be a mystic or won't be a Christian at all. I mean, I think that's what. It started happening in the 60s as people moved to Eastern traditions. People, like, they weren't finding it in Christianity, so they join a Buddhist community. And so I think that's been happening, and people are kind of leaving church. So the church as an institution needs to ask very pointed questions of itself. What are we missing? What do people need that we're not providing? And I think people say an experience of God. Quit talking about God and affirm. And people are having experiences of God. People are having those out in the woods or with psilocybin. And the church needs to be curious and affirm those. And as we talk to people, say, if somebody comes in with a psilocybin experience, say, "Oh my God, tell me more," instead of saying, "Don't do that." Like, don't tell me more. I'm curious.
Right.
How did you experience God? And then to say that's interesting because in Scripture or in the mystics, Julian Norwich had a similar experience, or Paul had a similar experience, or the Transfiguration is this experience. A lot of times people talk about they see light and they see themselves bathed in light. Well, look at the stories in Scripture about the Transfiguration. Jesus covered in light on a mountaintop. I got it.
So I wanted to say this for a little bit later, but I got to right now because you brought up the Transfiguration. I'm assuming that you're familiar with a lot of the artwork that's been kind of revealed from the 9th through 12th, 13th century that has mushrooms encoded or directly represented. Have you seen the engraving of the Transfiguration where Jesus is standing underneath of 3 big mushrooms. It's just like I just gave a presentation at the main Fungi Fest on the spirituality of
I'd love to
psychedelics,
see
and
that.
there is some incredible artwork that just is. It's to me, it's irrefutable evidence that Christianity has a psychedelic, at least time period. It might not have originated, like
Right.
John Mark Allegro tries to suggest. But it's very telling that there are so many pictures of Jesus or the apostles or Adam and Eve with mushrooms at their feet, and so
I know.
to understand that this is an intrinsic part of Judeo-Christianity, I think changes the relationship completely for a lot of people.
And let's just say that like there was no connection, but to see the mushrooms, to see what that says about creation, about the healing capacity of creation, and I think there's something to it. So I'm not, and I think Rodmer Rescue's book, I think the kind of the link he makes with the community, the John community, the Gospel of John, and Jesus and Dionysus. I think that work is very important. I mean, we don't have any direct proof, but there seems to be a lot of evidence pointing in that direction. And religions, including Christianity, evolve because people have experiences of God that don't quite fit the existing paradigm.
Right.
And Jesus was having experiences of God that didn't fit his own Jewish paradigm. And he never wanted to start another religion either. He just wanted to reform his own tradition. So, and Jesus was out in nature, and Jesus was having experiences of God. And the religious leaders of the time were all about the rules and all about, right belief instead of right practice. So, and there that's just an old story. That's religion has these beautiful periods of growth and expansion, and then contraction. It's just the natural process and order of things. This is nothing new. The decline of the church is nothing new. It's an opportunity for us to rethink what we're doing. And that doesn't mean every church has got mushrooms. I don't think this is even a Sunday morning activity for most people.
Yeah.
I think but let's take these experiences seriously, because you've got a lot of Christians having them, and let's really dig down and be interested in it.
Oh man, just that. Just taking the experience seriously. This is my 25th year that I've been actively involved in psilocybin work, and it's only, I feel like, just now that there is real legitimacy, perceived anyway with this work, and it's so redeeming.
Bless you for, seriously, bless you for doing that. I think it's been 8.5 years now. I'm a fairly newcomer to this, and I do bring some things to it, but I think the people that have been holding it and saw this 25 years, saw this a long time ago, and have benefited from it, and brought other people into that is incredible. So
I certainly feel blessed.
And then the indigenous traditions have held it even longer.
Absolutely.
I try to remember to say the church has done so much damage over the last, since its encounter with indigenous practices, always, not in the first 200 or 300 years, but later. And we've demonized and we've diminished and we've done a lot of damage. And I think indigenous communities mostly are interested that we're interested, and I think we've got to be careful to not appropriate, which is happening. And I think Christianity can do this without appropriating.
Well, I want to ask how you saw that, because that is an important part of this discussion, right? I mean, the Catholic Church just absolutely slaughtered people for their use of psilocybin in Central America, right? It was demonized. They were talking to demons. There's plenty of records of that. And so how do modern Christians now adopt these practices that the church, again, demonized for so long, without stepping on the toes or appropriating or, just the indigenous communities where this wisdom came from?
First of all, you acknowledge the sin. I think that's, and I'm not going to take in all the sins of the church, but as a church leader, I can acknowledge it, and I think atone for it. And I think that's one of the things we're trying to figure out is how do we not just lift up indigenous communities in practice, and not just thank them, but do some sort of reparative work. And I think at some point we're a little further along to actually fund indigenous work. And I don't know. That is an important part of what we're trying to figure out, and I want to prioritize that. So, and I think Christianity has plenty of its own ritual and story, and I don't think we need to appropriate anything from indigenous communities. I think we've got everything we need to keep people safe, to provide ritual. And I want to, before I forget, I want to lift up something we just did last week with a guy named Tom Riedlinger, who 20 years ago wrote an article for a book chapter about Maria Sabina and Gordon Wasson. It's called the Psychedelic Mushroom Pentecost. And what I didn't know about Gordon Wasson was that he was not just a practicing Christian, but his father was an Episcopal priest. He grew up in a family that took Scripture seriously, that took the tradition seriously, very open-minded Episcopal priest, his father was. And so when Gordon Wasson first encountered Maria Sabina, along with Gordon's wife, who was a mycologist, when they first encountered Maria Sabina, he saw the connection to Christianity. He saw it as a Pentecostal moment. He saw what she was doing in Mexico with her Catholic community as a very early church Pentecostal experience. And that chapter that we are sharing on our website and Tom's work really puts a direct connection to Maria Sabina's work, which connects back to early indigenous communities that almost got left out. And Maria Sabina's bishop knew exactly what she was doing and supported it. So it's not like everyone in the Catholic Church was demonizing it. And we've got to acknowledge our sins and atone for them, and then accept the grace and move on and not do it again. Be changed and not do that again.
Amen.
And I think Christianity, I think we've got to be really careful, Christians, in not appropriating these indigenous traditions, to take their wisdom and their medicine, but really we don't need to take their rituals.
Yeah, for sure. I mean,
unless they give us permission directly, which I know that.
Well, it's going to be an interesting kind of relationship to manage, because a lot of the wisdom that comes with these plants is buried within the ritual, right? So there are practices that I know of, at least within the Mesoamerican mushroom community, that I have come to understand as a very important part of the work with the sacrament, as we call it. But those practices, we don't, I guess where I feel there's a problem is when we start to kind of fetishize the all the stuff around it, and we don't get to the core of what the process is really trying to get at, right? So like the sexual proscriptions around sacrament use before mushroom trip, like in Oaxaca, from Maria Sabina's tradition, what I understand is it was not permitted, or it was requested people abstain from sex 3 days before and 3 days after a mushroom ceremony. And a lot of times I understood that originally as kind of a moral, ethical, purity type situation. And what I've come to understand now through studying various traditions and a lot of direct experience with the mushroom is that it's much more about conserving your energy so that you can really embed that healing into the core of your being, right? So like and then like the way that we give a lot of lip service to indigenous traditions, but we don't honor kind of the wisdom around long-term practicum with the medicine, with these sacraments, and we're just like throwing people out. So I don't know how we balance a lot of that when there's such a need for the work to be done. But I can tell you right now that 25 years in, I feel like I understand psilocybin like less than I ever did, because it's just such an continually unfolding mystery.
Right. I think the preparation in the early church, in the first few centuries of Christianity, it was a very secret mystery religion. It was in caves and catacombs in people's houses, and people just didn't get baptized. People just didn't show up on Sunday morning and get baptized. There was an extensive period of preparation, and then typically in the earliest days of the church, people would be baptized at the Easter Vigil, like on the night before Easter, after dark. They would wear white. They would show up in a very secretive way. They would had already spent weeks or months preparing. Then they would have that very mystical, magical, mysterious experience, and then they would begin their. Then they would move into their. Like, now what does it mean? Now what does it mean to live a Christian life and practice that? So I don't think there's enough preparation in psychedelic spaces. And I think because we're kind of desperate and people need healing, But for those of us that are thinking about this, which you and I are, what does the preparation look like? And I think that's what they're doing in these ayahuasca communities traditionally, is to do a lot of prep, and that month-long diet, and even the celibacy part. We finished our celibacy, but there's a reason for that. I think that's what people abstain from sex so that their energy is in a different place, and you're more mentally focused. And celibacy is a gift, but it's not if you think that's like just what we've done with that is we've messed that up too. We've messed up that. We've messed up fasting. We've made that about losing weight, but fasting is about letting your body connect to something beyond churning food. So again, fasting, celibacy, meditation, chanting, those are spiritual practices and gifts that can bring profound experiences of God. 40 days in the wilderness, I mean, right? I mean,
No, absolutely.
that's real. That's real. So
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, that's, our focus in terms of education is to kind of really do our best to first and foremost empower people to develop their own relationship with this sacrament before you consider going out and administering it. And understandably, a lot of people, they have these experiences, they feel the profound healing, and then they want to go out and spread that into their communities. But there is that's not without risk, right? The mystical experience isn't always pleasant. And I'm very curious as to your perspective around what I call atypical mystical experiences, right? I believe that every psilocybin experience, if properly integrated or explored, can be understood through a mystical lens. And I don't know, what are your thoughts around some of these?
I do think, I think we do. I mean, psilocybin seems to be less evoke these very, very difficult experiences. And I think we do have to, I think one of the things we haven't done a great job with so far is saying there is real, like, here's what you really need to know. Here's what's possible. Here's, some people have experiences that take us take a couple months to really recover from. And those are all, and we need more research around that. We need to say, and also to say, not everybody's going to get a beatific vision. Not everybody's going to have an experience of unicorns and rainbows. So you may think you're dying. You may,
which is a very mystical experience.
It's very mystical, and right there in the middle of this Christian tradition. Right there in I guess a religion based on the death of Jesus. So, and descent into hell. Those. So yeah, and we know that death doesn't have the final say.
I mean, I've had experiences where I've just been so, and this may just be reinforcement of my Christian upbringing, but so profound coming out of the experience in this birth and re-death that this is, not only is this part of Christian tradition, but this is the foundation of Christian tradition. And that I'm not willing to say right now that, Allegro was right and early Christianity was a mushroom cult, or that as far as it goes into Jesus being a mushroom, but there are some very interesting similarities between the phenomena of the experience, particularly at really high doses, and the story of the life of Christ, So there's so much here to explore.
Oh my God, yes. I mean, we mentioned the Transfiguration already, but I would say even some of those resurrection appearances of Jesus in John's Gospel, where he's moving through doors, whatever happened, people had an experience of their teacher and friend and leader being crucified, and then a few days later being in their midst. And it's not real clear in John's Gospel exactly what that means, but they're aware of him, and then we have to have a story that sort of expresses that and explains it in a way. So, So another story about Jesus that I think sort of is psychedelic is, and there's all three of the Synoptic Gospels have a story of Jesus being cast into the wilderness. But in Mark's Gospel, he's baptized and then goes into the wilderness for 40 days and is tempted by the devil, which means he has this, I would say in psychological terms, he encounters his shadow. And for 40 days, the story goes, he's in the wilderness and is tempted, sees what's possible, sees really a shadow leadership, the shadow of leadership, and the shadow of spiritual powers, you can do a lot of things. And what he does is say no to that and returns and then practices his ministry of healing, and is crucified for it. So uh, it's not all unicorns and rainbows, and it's
Well, now
all suffering.
I gotta ask you about your perspective on, um, what we describe as the spirit world, right? So indigenous traditions maintain that these tools allow us access into a spiritual world. And you're describing this experience of Christ, which has been depicted as a very profoundly spiritual experience in a psychological manner. And I'm curious if you see those two worlds as kind of, riding in the same car together, or how do you interpret this? Yeah.
I'm in the midst of a big eye opening. Right as I'm in the last couple of weeks,
Okay.
really. So before, let's say when I was preaching regularly and teaching regularly, in these stories of demon possession that are in the Old Testament too, but particularly in the New Testament, Jesus is always casting out demons and naming demons, and the way I would have explained that before was that this is pre-modern, that we didn't really understand mental illness, blah 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 blah. That's what I would intellectualize that.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not, and I still don't know exactly where I come to that, but I think Pentecostals, Christians, and in some ways more fundamentalist Christians have really always understood that there's we say spiritual warfare, and I'm not quite willing to go there, but I think there are what the tradition calls principalities and powers, and I would say that is alive and well. And I'm not sure exactly where I stand on it, but I'd say I need, and other Christians really need to take another look at that, especially those of us that are more in the intellectual kind of traditions of Christianity, to say maybe we need to revisit that and say, Dick Schwartz, who, I don't know, do you know Dick Schwartz, the family systems? He's really starting to talk now about entities.
Really?
Yeah. Just recently. That's why this discussion is really fresh for me. I was with a group of psychiatrists and therapists that are doing ketamine therapy just this past weekend at a little short conference, because they want to get insight from the religious and spiritual community, because they're experiencing in their work with people with ketamine of attached entities, what we might call demons and angels. And here we are. The Christian tradition has a lot to say about that, and we're not clear about it, but we need to take it. So I'm stammering because I'm not sure what I think about it, and yet I'm really taking it seriously now in a way that I had before.
This has become the frontier of my work. I mean, for years, I just attributed all of this to kind of psychological aberrations. And it's been years coming. I'm a staunch skeptic. I do not believe something just because I even see it or think it, right? And I just published an episode of this podcast last week where I gave a detailed description of an ongoing experience that I've been having, that I have no way to contextualize it other than this is a being that is making contact. And I've had two shared UFO experiences where craft, like these were actual craft that someone saw with me. And it's really shaken up my worldview. And I feel like I've been saying this within our community, that the psychedelic world is going to be looking for people like us who can provide some kind of insight, because I have performed, for lack of a better word, exorcisms with people who have had, and I just have to at this point acknowledge that a lot of this seems very real.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that we've done, the word activism, I think what most of us that are of a certain age go back to is the movie and Linda Blair, and so in the Episcopal Church, that's my tradition. That we have a lot of liturgies like the Catholic Church. Like there's a lot of things that are already said. Here's prayers you say when somebody died by suicide. Here's prayers you say when a child dies young. Here's what you say when you bless a house. And it's all gathered in a book that's called the Book of Occasional Services. And there's a page for exorcisms. And what it says in there basically is call your bishop, and the existing liturgies of the church can be helpful in this sort of thing, but you should not go into this by yourself and without a lot of your own spiritual work being to support and very well grounded. And it's Dick Schwartz is, I think, sort of saying is these entities can be addressed and can be dealt with, and there should be some compassion. Because if they are unattached, they're floating around out there. The fact that I'm saying this, I'm like, I figured it out.
I know.
So I don't want to sound like a French person. I'm not.
Yeah, well,
Even though I'm talking about drugs, I'm not a French person. I'm boring. But it's caused me to rethink in the last 3 weeks. Caused me to rethink it, and I would say for Christians or people that are just interested in this to go back to the New Testament and look to see how Jesus is handling these and what he's doing. He's typically naming them. I mean, there's one incident where he sends them out on pigs, but that may have more to do. That's more of a critique of the religious culture, maybe, but at the time. But that's a critique of something else. But typically, he names them, he casts them out, and then the people are with compassion, and then the people are healed. So,
my friend, I can tell you some stories. I have seen some things. I'm telling you.
I know, and I've not had that experience, but I've talked to people that have, not to the degree you have. And these psychiatrists are. So the fact that psychiatrists are asking, these are all ketamine, doing above ground ketamine work, and I think they said 1 in 8 they feel like they've got something like that. So they need resources, and they're not going to get that in their psychiatry textbooks.
No.
That's coming from us. That's going to have to come from us.
And a lot of this, again, in my mind, I go back to the conversation that we just had on unhealthy relationships with various things, right? And I would suggest that there is kind of a bit of some kind of a self-replicating cycle that when we engage with certain behaviors and anyway, I don't want to get too far off on my experiences and discussions around this, but it's really fascinating. I think it's really important that this becomes part of the conversation in the psychedelic community.
Yes. And I say this a lot, psychedelics is forcing a conversation between the medical, scientific, therapeutic community and spirituality and religion, all broadly understood. And psychology is dismissed religion and spirituality since the 50s. I mean, Jung certainly didn't, but later, and it became about medicalization. And so I think it's really requiring a revisit, and that's what this group of psychiatrists I was with last week. They need resources, and I want them to be able to confidently refer to clergy or to chaplains or spiritual directors who are open and not going to do some dogma,
right,
weird Christian conversion thing, but to be open to yes. And here's some tools we have. I just read yesterday. This is more about adverse experiences. Jules Evans, I don't know if you know him, doing a lot of good work around that. And they just published a study that said the most used and utilized antidote to adverse experience is prayer and meditation. Okay, and talking it through, having a trusted community. It's
so crucial.
I know, and that's like. Hello, that's what religion is. That's what you're doing. That's what I want churches to do. I want existing traditional churches to be places where people can. And it's not just about psychedelics. It's about anything to have a safe place to talk about trauma and depression. I mean, people shut up about their mental health when they come into church because the expectation is everything's okay. This is normal, and it's really not normal.
And that's the place where they should feel safest to be able to talk about.
I remember our preached a sermon one time that said, what if we all come here and told the damn truth? Like, how are you? I'm terrible. My husband's drinking too much. My son's going off the deep end. I feel like I'm having suicidal thoughts. Like, I'm about to go bankrupt. Let's just put it out there. And of course, you can do that in small. Of course, that's not going to happen in a room with 300 people. But if we could have small groups of people that were totally transparent and trusted it, and knew that they had a safe container. Oh my God!
That's the core of sanctuary.
Good.
That's the core of what we do, and that's I talk about my BPD publicly. I talk about my stuff publicly in an effort to encourage other people to do the
Good.
same.
Good.
Are you familiar at all with Chris Bledsoe's work?
No.
I would strongly recommend you look into Chris Bledsoe's work. He wrote a book. The title is a little off-putting, but it's called UFO of God, and he is the most documented experiencer to date who's been studied by the CIA. He advises NASA. He was a construction worker that started having these experiences, and so much of it leads back to this divine mother, right? And there seems to be some significant shift that's occurring right now that is waking us up to this spiritual world.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I mean, so much that divine feminine, Mary Magdalene. Mary Magdalene comes to people who have really no understanding, and we've screwed up that story too. But people have no. I mean, Cynthia Bourgeot does amazing work with Mary Magdalene and Jesus as partners in. As Mary Magdalene is his partner in his ministry, is really how she frames.
Who wrote? We just read the Mary Magdalene Revealed. Oh, Megan Watterson. Have you read?
Okay. I've heard. I know the book, but yeah. So I think that's what's breaking in is the patriarchy, and the church is just eating up with that. I mean, look at the church.
Well,
and that's
psychology and psychiatry as well.
Healthcare is eating up with it.
Healthcare
is eating up with it, and hierarchy and patriarchy.
So that's where I feel like the psychedelic, we're still just such in an infantile stage of working with psychedelics. And, the irony of particularly the psychiatric world kind of speaking of these tools with authority that they really haven't earned because, well, for one, up until about 5-10 years ago, they were completely dismissed and, believed to induce mental psychosis rather than heal it. And then when you take in the spiritual component that has, again, been dismissed, and that's not to say in any way that to devalue psychiatry or the medical world, but this, like you said, the blending of the spiritual medical models, I think that holistic perspective is going to bring us the healing, the well-rounded healing that we need.
Yeah, we need healthcare. I mean, obviously,
for sure,
and that's a gift from God. But but it's become profit driven, and it's become doctors have become the new priests, and that's a problem too. But the church has abdicated its own role. I can't remember who it was that said, somebody in psychedelic research, I said that if the church ever got its act together, or maybe it's not psychiatry, if the church ever got its act together, we wouldn't need psychiatry because those needs to be met in community.
For sure. No, we were just having that conversation.
There's so many Christians that demonize psychiatry and psychology and don't go to a therapist. And I think, if you get for Christians to find a therapist, a practicing therapist who values the religious tradition is the sweet spot. So
what are you seeing in terms of other religious leaders and their kind of adoption of psychedelics or curiosity? What do you see there?
A lot. In Denver, we were in Denver at the Psychedelic Science Conference, and I'm not sure how many people in that room, maybe 400. I was on a panel. The Buddhist panel was first, then the Christian panel. And I thought, oh, gosh, the Buddhist room was full. I thought, most people will leave, and there'll be about 100 people in here, and I'll know half of them. Well, the room, a little bit filled back up. And then I stood out in the hall for another 2 hours, just talking to a lot of clergy and a lot of people that were trying to hang on to Christianity about this. And a lot of people went to seminary because of a psychedelic experience with psilocybin or LSD. At some point in their younger years.
Really?
That's a pretty common story. And I hope we're providing them cover eventually to talk about it. And then people have just, maybe like I did in life, had the opportunity to have that experience and mostly affirmed. Psychedelics only really affirmed and deepened my own understanding of the Christian tradition. I didn't have any desire to leave it. I had a desire to wake the rest of the church up to what's possible, is really what I had to bring this healing into the mainstream conversation. Again, it's not for everybody. It's not a magic bullet, but it's a valuable tool that we need to take seriously. And if we don't care about healing, I'm not sure what the church cares about. So, And I saw a lot of interest. And I've not gotten the pushback that I thought I would, and I'm sure it's coming. And there's been a few quarters of
There'll be some,
criticism,
yeah.
but and a lot of people, probably the more fundamentalist branches of Christianity, haven't quite awakened to this. And yet, for them, I think there might be real interest in what's possible for veterans. I'm often conservative politics and fundamentalism, and I think we should. I mean, we need to do more than we're doing for veterans. And if we can bring healing from their PTSD, then we need to really
Oh God,
go double down on that.
absolutely.
And many of these guys are Christian. Many of these guys are Christian and have not found a place in Christianity to be honest about it because it's hard stuff. It's terrible things we're dealing with. And it creates a critique of the military-industrial complex, too. So
Absolutely. Now I work with a lot of veterans. And
good.
some of the most amazing, like I grew up in a very anti-military household. I was the biggest fuck the police person you ever saw. And then I started working with military and retired law enforcement in Jamaica. And I was just like, these are some of the sweetest, most caring human beings that really want to serve. That's their entire mission is to be of service to their nation and the world. So
and what we ask of them is,
oh my God,
we ask them to be not just a police officer, but they walk into a domestic dispute, they've got to be a therapist. We've put way too much pressure on them, and we're bringing in, I think one of the problems in policing right now is we're bringing in unhealed veterans.
Oh, for sure.
Into these traumatized veterans into spaces where they're being re-traumatized. And what happens, as we saw with George Floyd and other, as you saw in Louisville, there's with Breonna Taylor, we're just perpetuating. They're traumatized and it's perpetuating the trauma and doing terrible damage to innocent people. So
I have a dream of somehow being able to use psilocybin to work with at-risk communities and law enforcement to heal those individually and then eventually come together. I'm curious though, now we've talked a lot about traditional churches embracing psychedelics, but how do you view kind of standalone psychedelic churches or the kind of Native American incorporated churches? How do you see those kind of in and of themselves, and then in terms of a potential for collaboration with traditional churches?
Well, I think that's right. I always say I'm so grateful that people like you and others are making this available to people. And people have asked me, "Do you want to start a psychedelic church?" And I say, I have a church. I'm trying to wake it up to it. I'm trying to wake the Episcopal Church and just Christianity in general. I'm trying to activate the network to wake the church up to it. And I think we need as many points of entry as we can get. I think one of the concerns, this is a concern about more traditional Christian communities too, is how do we keep people safe? I think what we learned in the 90s, with the scandals, not just in the Catholic Church, but the Southern Baptist Convention is going through a huge problem right now. The seminary in Louisville, in the middle of it, with sexual misconduct. And again, it's men misbehaving. But and there's no women there, there's no accountability. So how do we keep people safe? And I think that's maybe one concern I have about freelancing, independent communities doing this is where's the oversight, where's the accountability? How do we make sure that people are not being put in vulnerable positions? Because you mix mystical psychedelic experiences with power and religion, it's a powder keg. And so that's what clergy get in trouble, because you're mixing some intimacy, you're mixing wounded people, you're mixing a kind of inflated ego in some cases. Clergy often have an inflated ego. That's part of it. So we've really got to figure out how to keep people safe. And that has to be transparent. It has to be there has to be a cycle of accountability, and we have to. Then, when there's an overstep, then what do? How do we? We don't have to demonize people. We don't have to cast them into the wilderness. But how do we help people atone for that and come back into the community?
No, it's a very important issue to address.
We're so punitive. We don't have to be punitive. We have to be transparent and honest and open.
100%.
And have systems of accountability.
Yeah, so, we've tried to be very blatant about this in our code of ethics and our addressing and how people, because it's inevitable. People are going to have relationships are going to form. So how do we bring those into an open dialogue, a transparent discussion, so that everybody can just at least be as aware as possible of the decisions they're making and their relationships they're engaging in. Outside of harm reduction and safety concerns, I've thought since starting the church, I was pretty disheartened by the competitive nature of psychedelic companies in Jamaica, particularly. It's a land grab. Everybody's trying to get a piece of that action, and it's happening in the States now too. But my hope is that the churches, legitimate above ground churches who are practicing in the open, who put safety first, can really collaborate in order to my hope anyway is to kind of revive spirituality in the U.S. and around the world. And I think there's a really incredible opportunity here for these different faith traditions or even brand new faith traditions to kind of work together to raise that awareness.
Right. I think the more we can collaborate, the more I can learn from you, and you can learn from what we're doing. And I think that if we could see that we're creating a net of safety and a net of accountability and a net of relationship. I just think it's all about relationship and networks of people that are all focused on. If we're all focused on the healing, then God is present there. I think that's just, and so I wouldn't say the more the merrier, but I'd say we've got to make sure that there's systems of accountability and and transparency. That's the most important thing. And that's where the church that's where the Catholic Church and the Episcopal Church and others got in trouble, is because these things would happen and we hide them. We protect the clergy instead of bringing the clergy in and saying, "Oh my God, like what happened? Let's make sure this person is made whole, and then let's make sure you're made whole, and then let's reintegrate you back into the community because you obviously have got something you're traumatized by.
Yeah.
And how can we heal that? And
absolutely.
But let's not throw you back. Let's not send you to another parish. Let's do the same thing.
So are you actively, do you do any outreach to kind of non-spiritual psychedelic communities or standalone psychedelic communities? I'm really interested in how people are responding to Christian language in the context of psychedelic spirituality.
It's hard to know. I don't know. So because we're in the United States or in the West, Christianity is baked in. Whether people want to admit that or not, it's baked in.
Right.
I mean, the stories are it's baked into the music, it's baked into the story, it's in many ways baked into how we govern ourselves. So we can't avoid it. And I just want there to be a healthier understanding of Christianity out there, and people don't have to be a Christian to benefit from Christian spiritual practices. I mean, if people want to take on a Christian identity, great. But I want the resource. I want Richard Rohr's work to be out there. I want Julian of Norwich. I want people to be aware that there is this 2,000-year tradition that 3,000 if you bring Judaism into that, a 3,000-year tradition of mysticism and explaining things, that are trying to make meaning of things that you can't explain. And how we can benefit from knowing about these parts of the tradition, whether we adopt them as our own or not, to know that meditation and prayer can be one of the ways to recover from a harrowing experience, to make meaning of it, return to prayer, return to meditation, turn it over to God, turn it over to your higher power. That's one way to do it. That's a very helpful way to do it. And that's straight out of Christianity, for better or worse. So
I haven't really thought about that, but like we have no problem like adopting yoga or tantra or qigong or all this. But the minute somebody starts adopting a Christian practice, then people kind of like.
Well, and that's the fault. I blame that on I mostly blame that on the church and beating people up. But I used to live in Seattle for 8 years, and I would go to yoga classes sometimes. And with the time I was doing that, there'd always be some kind of little thing at the end, which I would call the sermon. They wouldn't call it, but they would refer to every spiritual teacher except Jesus, every spiritual teacher. And I get it. I get these people beaten up by it and don't have a very healthy understanding of Christianity. But and people with, that's just. And then the church again they missed the boat on embodied spiritual practice. People went to yoga classes because they wanted their body to be part of the experience. And what we do to most people in churches, strap them to a pew and then do church to them, and then they go home. But at least in the Catholic Church, and maybe the people get up and down and go to the altar. But that's about it. That's about all the body gets to do, sing maybe. But some quarters of Christianity demonize yoga. But mostly I would drive to church on Sunday morning, walking past people with their yoga mat, going to a yoga class, and that's good for them. They were finding meaning and spirituality there. But we could have been doing that too, in different ways. So I don't want the church to miss the boat on this. We have a ministry here, and I don't want the church to miss the boat on having a ministry of healing. Wherever that's going to play out.
Yeah. Well, and because these are directly spiritual tools, then I think the church needs to have a seat at the table on it. I mean, whether you like it or not, these traditions are some of the only kind of context that we have for a lot of the experiences that people are bringing out of the psychedelic realm. And
you're bringing that in Kentucky, so you're bringing your own Christian background. You're bringing everybody else that's coming to you got some experience, whether it's positive or negative, to that. So it's coming in, and
there's a ton of Christian trauma recovery in our community and others. I mean, that's why I left the Catholic Church, was because of the pedophilia. I was like, oh, well, this is a fucking lie. Everything that they've been saying is complete and utter bullshit if they're hiding this, shoving this under the rug. And it's only in the last couple of years, honestly, that I've even started to come to terms with the word God, to be able to use that again as an expression of this ineffable. So it's going to be a fascinating unfolding here. I'm so my hope sincerely is, and it's so interesting how much this journey has morphed for me over the years. But my hope now is that psychedelics, in particular psilocybin, because it's so easy to grow here in Kentucky, we have tons of wild psilocybin all over the country, is that spirituality is going to be rejuvenated, because I feel like that is the crux of our mental health.
Oh my God, me too.
Crisis.
We're in a spiritual crisis. We're in a crisis of meaning, and it's manifesting as all kinds of mental health and addiction and to all kinds of things. But I think that's COVID just exacerbated it, but that was already happening.
So what do you see as the future of Ligare? How do you see this for the next 2 or 3 years?
I think it's continuing. We're crowdsourcing resources. I think it's a loose network, and I really want to take advantage of the existing networks of Christianity. We've got denominations. There are multiple nodes, and I want Ligare to be part of a network of people interested in spiritual healing, with psychedelics, and then I want the existing network of Christianity to be activated to catch people, to be curious, and to bring all of these resources of Christianity into the conversation. And I think that's a 3 to 5 year project. I think we eventually go away. I think once we do so, maybe way down the road we start working on retreats. But I think for now it's gathering resources, bringing resources into ways that people can receive them, and then just activating the network to do that. And so to have communities in all over other parts of the country, I don't want to be a church. I want this to get into the churches. And I want, for what you're doing, for however we can help you bring these mystical, contemplative resources of Christianity and to help the people you're working with.
And we have a ton of Christians in our church, right? So, are you familiar? I'm sure you're familiar with Steve Urquhart of the Divine Assembly in Utah. Yeah, he's also an interview in this chapter. And
good.
I have such an admiration for his work. Guy. I just I can't commend him enough. I had no idea when we got on the call last week. He started out with saying he had recently been diagnosed with BPD, and we were both just like, "Oh, of course, it's the crazy people starting the psychedelic churches, isn't it?" But no, there's just so much opportunity to work together and bring such needed healing to this world, and I really appreciate what you're doing within Christianity to open this conversation up. It's it's the elephant in the room,
Christianity is the elephant in the psychedelic room, and I think I think the elephant in Christianity is people are just not having the experiences of
Yeah,
God
there's no experience. Yeah.
and crave it and crave it.
Hmm.
People do, but even when they do, it's not affirmed by the local
Mm.
congregation of the community because we
Hmm.
put way too much emphasis on the clergy and their experiences. They become the professional Christian, and clergy take that on, and parishioners put that on us, and it's just it's a bad synergy, and we don't say and church is not the only place, maybe way far from the only place that people can have experiences of God. And you should be having these experiences at home around the dinner table. You should be
Yes.
having those out on your run, out and when you're going for a hike, when
Yes.
you're and come to church so you can get filled back up. But no, these are experiences are happening everywhere. And you don't need a mushroom, but if you do need a boost, then maybe find a way to have a safe and legal or safe and guided experience of psilocybin. That might be one
Indeed.
thing to do.
Indeed.
So
Indeed.
bless you for what you're doing and the care you're taking and the seriousness you're taking in the spiritual. Because I think a lot of people there's a money grab. There's a money grab in all this, and I think people are setting up churches so that they can do drugs. And I think so. That's where I am concerned about that. I do
For
think
sure.
there's
For
some of
sure.
that. And
No, there's definitely. I mean, this thing just went down in Detroit. Just drives me crazy. You know, like, it's like, are you serious? Like, you're gonna call yourself a church and have billboards that say "got shrooms" with
I know.
a phone number? Just drives me crazy.
I know, I'm sure.
Um,
Yeah, the bad actors, whatever
mhm.
the bad actors in Christianity make it. There was a time when I was recently ordained that I would walk because we typically wear a collar too, and I could just almost feel people pulling their children away because this clergy scandal was fresh. It's like
Mhm.
it just and I get it. I'm not. I mean, I understand why people feel that way, but
Mhm.
the bad act. That's why it's incumbent on all of us to really call out or be aware the bad actors are out there and
Mhm.
really do the best we can to be an alternative to that and to be very
Absolutely.
transparent. And so,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely. Well, the last question I always ask every guest is, "What does psilocybin say to you, Hunt?"
Wow. Psilocybin says to me, this, I love that. I think psilocybin says to me, if the church doesn't care about healing, then what does it care about?
Mm.
It's a question. Psilocybin asks a question of me.
Mhm. Oh, yes, it has lots of questions of me.
Yeah,
That's right.
psilocybin says to me, I am a gift from God for the people of God
Mm,
for healing.
mm.
Which goes back to the first chapter of Genesis that everything in creation is good, and it's meant for it's meant for the good of all things, not just people, but meant for the good of the whole created order.
Yes.
And so it's great. Yeah. So yes, be careful. Yes, do some discernment, but don't be afraid. Don't be afraid.
Yeah, because I mean, what you're going to counter is just yourself.
Right. Exactly. And if there's one thing it says in Scripture over and over again, is don't be afraid.
Amen. Amen. Thank you so much for joining me, Hunt.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you.